Okay, open your Bibles, please, to Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah chapter 40. And while you're turning there and getting settled, let me just say I'm glad to be here. I've been looking forward to this meeting for a few years now. Somebody made a comment to me last night and said, "Man, you're really doing something pretty risky, bringing 4 kids, across a few states to come do a week-long meeting with all the lessons you're going to be preaching." And I said, "Yeah, but when this meeting was scheduled, there were only 2 kids. So, we don't know how these things are going to work out ultimately, but I'm glad to be here with my wife and with all 4 of my children." I told her when we moved to South Carolina a couple of years ago that anytime a church in Alabama asks me to do a meeting, I'll say yes, so that we can come back and see all of our family that's here and see all of our friends that are here. And I'm kind of going back on that a little bit because we've learned that traveling with 4 kids is not really easy. So we'll do some meetings in Alabama. Maybe we'll say that. So I'm glad to be here this week. Looking forward to the lessons all week long, and particularly the morning sessions. I'm really glad that the Eastside Church does that. Not a lot of churches do morning sessions anymore. That was something that was really popular years ago, or so I'm told. But not many churches do it. But I've done enough meetings to know that when you go and stay somewhere for a few days or a week, a lot of times in the mornings, if you're the visiting preacher, you're maybe doing some work for the next Sunday that you'll be back home, but sometimes it's like, man, I wish I could be of some use while I'm here. Got all this time that I'm just wasting throughout the day, and so I'm glad to be able to use that time, and I hope you can be here with us if you're able to do that. Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah has been called the miniature Bible. I think it's interesting that Isaiah is referred to that way. There's a lot of similarities between the book of Isaiah and the Bible as a whole. The Bible as a whole has 66 books that comprise it. Isaiah has 66 chapters. Now, we know Isaiah didn't put the chapter divisions in there. That didn't come until many, many years after Isaiah wrote. Maybe that's just a fortunate coincidence. The book of Isaiah naturally divides into 2 sections. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah are chapters that are filled with judgment language against God's people for their evil and their idolatry and their wickedness. And God gives repeated warnings, and the language in those chapters is just not very hopeful. It's not very bright. But contrast that with chapter 40 through 66, the last 27 chapters of Isaiah, where there's this shift in language, where the message of Isaiah becomes much more hopeful, much more optimistic. There's a lot of messianic passages in that final section of the book. And of course, the Bible as a whole divides into 2 sections. 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New. If you could summarize the entire Bible in one word, in one person, that would be Jesus, right? Well, the book of Isaiah has a lot to say about Jesus, doesn't it? A lot of messianic passages in Isaiah, very vivid pictures of the Messiah and what he is going to be like when he comes and what God is going to do through him when his kingdom comes, that messianic kingdom that Isaiah discusses. And so for those reasons, Isaiah is called the miniature Bible. I want to latch onto that word miniature for our lesson this morning. Small. Because when you come to this second section of the book of Isaiah, I mentioned begins in chapter 40. Isaiah starts off this glorious, hopeful, optimistic section of his book. First thing he does is talk about how magnificent God is. And what you see as you read through chapter 40 of Isaiah is that we, in contrast, are quite small, powerless, and really, in the grand scheme of things, perhaps even insignificant. Chapter 40, look at verse 9. "Get yourself up on a high mountain, O Zion, bearer of good news. Lift up your voice mightily, O Jerusalem, bearer of good news. Lift it up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God." So in this chapter, Isaiah is saying to the people, this is your God. I am going to show you what he is like. I'm going to give you a very graphic depiction of the God of our people. So in chapter 40 in verse 10, behold, the Lord God will come with might, with his arm ruling for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense is before him. Whenever you see in the Bible a reference to God's arms, that is an indication of God's power and his strength. When you and I go outside, maybe this time of year, maybe the spring or the summer, we're going to do some yard work. We talk about rolling up our sleeves. What do we mean when we say that? We mean we're getting ready to do some work. We're preparing ourselves to get dirty, to use our strength, to do some manual labor of whatever it is, and we are pulling our power together so we can accomplish this task. Same thing in the Bible when you read about God's arm being displayed. God's power is going to be seen. And here he says in verse 10 that God's power is ruling and he is bringing a reward for his people, those who are faithful to him, but he's bringing judgment upon his enemies. But now look at verse 11. Like a shepherd, he will tend his flock, and in his arms he will gather the lambs and carry them in his bosom, and he will gently lead the nursing ewes. The same arms of God that bring forth reward for his people and judgment and wrath upon his enemies, the same powerful arms of God that bring those things are also the same arms that God uses to tenderly hold his people close to his breast and care for them. It's a beautiful picture of how God interacts with his people. So now, in verse 12 of Isaiah chapter 40, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? All of the waters of the earth. When I was a kid, they told me that 75% of the earth was covered in water. I doubt that's changed. I'm sure that number's pretty much right. You take all of the oceans and the lakes and the ponds and the rivers, and Isaiah says God holds all of those in the palm of his hand. He says he has marked off the heavens with a span. A span is a unit of measurement. In the ancient world, if I understand this correctly, a span was the distance between the tip of a man's thumb and the tip of his pinky finger. And so if you were to ask God, how big is the universe that you've made? He would say, oh, it's about that big. How big is God then? What is God's perspective on all of this? It says he has calculated the dust of the earth in a measure. How many grains of sand are there in the deserts of Africa? How many grains of sand are there on the coastlines along all of the seas and the beaches in this world? God calculates every single grain of sand on this earth. He goes on to say in verse 12 that God has weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance. So in the ancient world, they would use scales to measure how much of a product was being purchased. And so you would say, I want so many, whatever unit of measurement it was, I want so many pounds of this product. And so they would put that on the scale. And then they would, on the other side of the scale, they would put the money that you were using to pay for it and make sure the weights came out the way that they were supposed to. They had all that figured out. And what Isaiah says is, God manipulates the mountains and the hills the same way that we manipulate products and monies and weights and measurements. God can take Mount Everest and put it on the scale. How big is the God that we serve? And so as Isaiah is launching into this depiction of God and his power and his greatness and just how small we are in comparison, then he says in verse 13, who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has informed him? With whom did he consult, and who gave him understanding? And who taught him in the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and informed him of the way of understanding? And what Isaiah basically says in those two verses is, did God have to come to any of us and ask us how to do all this? When God was creating and when he was making this universe, did he come to us and say, hey, do you think I should do it this way, or do you think I should do it that way? God doesn't need us for any of this. His wisdom is so much greater than ours. And in fact, in a future chapter, Isaiah is going to say that exact thing. That God's thoughts are not our thoughts. And He thinks higher and farther and more deeply than we could ever imagine. God didn't consult any of us when He did all these great and powerful works that He has done. Now let's go out of Isaiah for a moment. Put your marker here in chapter 40. We'll come back to this, but go with me now to the book of Job. And I want to go to Job chapter 26. Job 26. I'm not going to rehearse the story of Job. I think most of us are probably very familiar with his troubles and all of the problems that fell upon him. But you remember Job's friends. They come to visit him when they hear about all these bad things that have happened. And some friends they turn out to be, right? They just come and tell Job that he's an awful person and that God is punishing him because he's been so evil and wicked. And in Job chapter 26, and in verse 11 beginning, I love what Job says here. He says, "The pillars of heaven tremble, and they are amazed at his rebuke. He quieted the sea with his power, and by his understanding he shattered Rahab. By his breath the heavens are cleared. His hand has pierced the fleeing serpent." Now, notice verse 14. "Behold, these are the fringes of his ways." You know, sometimes we launch into a discussion of some topic, and it's a very vast and deep topic. The breadth is so overwhelming. And we say, yeah, we're not even touching the hem of the garment of this. That's what Job says here. He says the things that we see in this world, the things that we know about God, he said those are the mere fringes of what God is capable of doing. We're not even touching the hem of the garment of what God is capable of. And at the end of verse 14, he says, "How faint a word we hear of him." If I understand the expression, I think what Job is saying is, you know, we can look around us and we can see a whole lot of things that God has done. But everything that we see, it's just a fraction of what God could show us. I think the New King James Version says, these are the mere whispers of the ways of God. That the things that we see that God has done, those are God's whispers. Well, what if God had decided to use a yelling voice? How overwhelmed would we be by what He has done? These are just the edges of the ways of God, Job says. I love that language. Now, turn over to Job chapter 42. Job 42. Similar idea here. Now this is after Job and his friends have had their back and forth exchanges all throughout the book. And now at this point, God has come to speak to Job. And He really puts Job in his place. He says, you don't need to be questioning these things because of this principle here in Isaiah 40. Job, you're speaking about things you don't understand. And so Job comes to acknowledge that. He recognizes that God is exactly right, that he's been put into his place. And in Job chapter 42 and verse 1, Job answered the Lord and he said, "I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you instruct me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I retract, and I repent in dust and ashes." Job says, God, you're exactly right. You've come, you've spoken sense to me. I realize I was saying things that I didn't understand. And I want to latch onto that expression for just a moment. Did you notice that he said that? There in verse 3, he says, "I have declared things which I did not understand, things that are too wonderful for me, which I did not know." Can I take a little sidetrack here and just comment on that? Have you ever found yourself speaking above your level of knowledge? And it manifests itself, I think, primarily for us in this. maybe we personally are going through some trial, some difficulty, some crisis even. We're going through something that is just so overwhelming and our faith is being challenged. Or maybe it's not us. Maybe it's somebody we know. Maybe it's a loved one, a friend, a church member. They're going through some terrible thing, some chronic illness or tragedy has fallen upon them, whatever it may be. And what we do when our friends and our loved ones are going through that, or when we're facing those kinds of things, we try to explain them. We try to make sense of them. That's only natural for us to do that. But we try to explain them and make sense of them because we feel like if we're able to do that, it gives us some sense of control over the situation. Well, I know exactly what's going on here. I can explain exactly what this is. This is why this is happening. I know what's going on. And so if we're able to do that, we feel like I've got some control over the situation. But folks, oftentimes what happens as we try to explain what's going on in our lives or what's going on in someone else's life, we come and we offer them explanations that are really not all that helpful at all. And so here's a person who is going through some tragedy. They've lost a loved one or something like that. And we go to them and we say things like, well, you know, God has a plan for you in this. Folks, we need to be careful when we're using that kind of language. Because what that implies is we know what God is doing. That we somehow have been in the mind of God and we know what God is thinking, we know what His plans are, and so we can confidently say, hey, God's doing something for you in this. God has a plan for you. We need to be careful. Because I think what we're doing when we say things like that is we're doing what Job did. And we're speaking about things that are too wonderful for us. We're speaking above our level of knowledge. Are you with me on that? So Isaiah says, when did God consult any of you about how to do this? When did God come and talk to you about any of this? All these great things, these majestic things that God has done. He doesn't need your help. He doesn't need my help. But rather, what we ought to do is sit back as Job did, close our mouths, and say, wow. Now let's go back to Isaiah chapter 40. Look at the next expression. Isaiah chapter 40. I told you to put your marker there, and I didn't put mine there. I didn't follow my own instruction. Isaiah chapter 40. Now look with me at verse 15. Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket. You know, water is a pretty powerful force, isn't it? If you've ever watched hurricanes that roll into the coastlines and destroy homes and businesses and do millions and millions of dollars worth of damages, water can be a very destructive force. But how destructive is just one little drop? If I came up to you and just flicked a drop of water onto your face, are you going to fall over to the floor? And Isaiah says, all the nations of the earth, they're just like one drop of water. It's nothing. And in the next expression, verse 15, he says, they are regarded as a speck of dust on the scales. So this guy in the picture, he's been up in his grandmother's attic, and he found a book up there that's 100 years old. It's been sitting in that attic for all that time. And he picks it up and it's real dusty, and so he blows the dust off of the book, and you can see that dust coming off of it. Isaiah says, if God wants to topple a kingdom, all He has to do, that's it. They're the dust on the scale. Verse 16. Even Lebanon is not enough to burn, nor its feasts enough, or its beasts enough for a burnt offering. I love this expression. You read in the Bible about the cedars of Lebanon, the great trees of that portion of the world. King David used, or Solomon rather, used those to build the temple. These are these majestic trees. And Isaiah says, you could burn the whole forest and take all of the beasts of the area and throw them in the fire, and that would not be a sacrifice of praise great enough to give to God. Verse 17, all the nations are as nothing before Him. They are regarded by Him as less than nothing, and meaningless. It doesn't mean that God doesn't care about the nations of the earth. When it says they're meaningless, it doesn't mean He doesn't care about people. It means that they're small, that they have no power in comparison to His power. And so then, verse 18, critical passage. To whom then will you liken God, Isaiah asks? Or what likeness will you compare with Him? You see, Isaiah has been, throughout this chapter, he's been working toward this question. Because here, he's now going to shift the focus to the idolatry of the people. And so from verse 9 through verse 17, he's been talking about all these expressions about God's greatness and how powerful and how amazing God really is. And he says in verse 18, now what are you going to compare Him to? Well, what were they trying to compare Him to? Well, look at verse 19. As for your idols, a craftsman casts it, a goldsmith plates it with gold, and a silversmith fashions chains of silver. He who is too impoverished for such an offering selects a tree that does not rot. He seeks out for himself a skillful craftsman to prepare an idol that will not totter. This is what they were comparing to God. They are given over to idolatry at this point in their history, and Isaiah says, I want you to see how foolish that is. You are going to a goldsmith, asking him to make some idol for you, and then you're worshiping the thing that a human has created, saying that it created you. And you go to the silversmith, and you tell them to do the same thing. Or if you can't afford that, you go out in your backyard, you chop down a tree, you get out your knife, and you make your own idol with it. And you got to make sure that you put it on a flat spot because you don't want your idol to totter. You don't want, it's bad when your idol falls over, right? I mean, you're praying to the idol and then he falls over. That's embarrassing. So Isaiah says, you go to these great lengths to make sure that your idols look good and that these craftsmen have made them very beautiful and elaborate, and then you turn to those things and you worship those things? Things that were made by the hands of men? To whom are you going to liken God? So then verse 21, he says, do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is He who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. Isaiah says that God stretches out the heavens like a curtain. All right. What happened to my slide? There we go. Okay, there it is. I hit the blank screen button. I shouldn't have done that. All right, I won't do that anymore. God sits above the circle of the earth. The inhabitants of the earth are like grasshoppers. Do you remember what the people of Israel said when the 12 spies were sent into the land? And 10 of them came back, and what did they say about those men, those armies that were there in the land of Canaan? Oh, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. How much more, then, in the sight of God? How small are we in comparison to Him? Then Isaiah says in chapter 40 and verse 26, lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these stars. The one who leads forth their host by number, He calls them all by name. Talked a moment ago about speaking above our level of knowledge. Let me do that for just a moment. I know nothing about astronomy. Quite frankly, I don't care to know anything about astronomy. It's just not a particular interest of mine. And I realize in North Alabama, that's a dangerous thing to say. And some of you NASA guys could correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I am told by people who study such things that there are trillions of stars in the universe. And Isaiah says God has a name for every single one of them. God knows your name as well. Jesus said the very hairs of your head are all numbered. 5 years ago, that number for me used to be a lot higher. My hair keeps moving backwards. I asked Stacy if she would love me when I had any hair, and she immediately said, "Of course not." God calls them all by name. How vast is the mind of God? How vast is the wisdom of God? Isaiah says this is what He is able to do. So lift up your eyes. Go outside, those of you who live out in the country. Go outside at night and lift up your eyes and see all of those stars on a clear night and know that God has a name for each one of them. So again, verse 25, Isaiah records this. Notice this time it's God speaking. To whom then will you liken me, that I would be his equal, says the Holy One. So you get this picture that Isaiah is painting for us about the magnificence, the majesty, the greatness, the power of God, and just how amazing He is. And here are His people in Judah, bowing down to carvings and trees, bowing down to idols made out of metal that they fashioned with their own hands. Idols that don't hear when they pray to them. Idols that don't do anything when they ask for help. And Isaiah says, you are so foolish to trust in those things, to search for fulfillment in those things, to find satisfaction in those things, when this is the God whom you serve. Now, just like all preachers, Isaiah has people who don't like what he's preaching. So in chapter 40 and verse 27, why do you say, O Jacob, and assert, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and the justice due me escapes the notice of my God? Yeah, I hear you, Isaiah. You keep harping about idolatry and how terrible it is, and you keep telling us that we're evil and we're in sin. But listen, God doesn't even know what I'm doing. God's so far removed from us, He doesn't care about us anymore. He's not concerned about the things that we're doing. And God says, oh, really? I have a name for every star in the universe, and you think I don't know what you're doing? You think I can't see what you're involved in? Do you not know, verse 28, have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, He does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. Don't think for a moment that God is tired of chasing you around trying to keep up with you and your activities. Don't think for a moment that God has gotten weary and sick of watching you and your behavior. He knows exactly what you're doing, and He will always know exactly what you're doing because He never gets tired. He never becomes weary. God is controlling the entire universe. And you think He doesn't see what you're up to? He gives strength to the weary, and to him who lacks might, He increases power. Isaiah says, don't try to run away from God. Don't think you can hide from Him and think that He's not aware. Instead of running away from Him, what you need to do is run to Him. You need to come back to Him. Because He says in verse 30, though young people grow weary and tired, and vigorous young men stumble badly, yet those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and they will not become weary. Don't try to hide from God. Don't try to run away from God. What you need to do instead is look to Him and draw upon His strength and His power. The strength, the power of God that did all of these great things that Isaiah has said in this chapter, that's the strength that He can give to you if you will come to him in faith. So now as we come to the close of this chapter, I want to close with 3 lessons. 3 very simple observations that I think we easily pick up on from Isaiah chapter 40. All right, here's the first one. God is awesome in every sense of the word. And here's a point that I want to make with that. We need to be careful about using the word awesome. When we say something is awesome, what we're saying is it is awe-inspiring. It produces awe within us. So what do? We go to Sonic for half-price milkshakes. And we say, hey man, this chocolate peanut butter shake is awesome. No, it isn't. Although it is quite good. I had one 2 nights ago. It is not awesome. God is awesome. If you use the word awesome all the time in your speech, what do you say when you find something that truly is awesome? Cool. 5 years ago or so, Stacy and I took an anniversary trip out west. We went to southern Utah to do some hiking out in some of the national parks down there. And we made a one-day trip over to the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And as we're sitting there on the edge of the canyon, probably not a smart thing to do looking back on it, but you know, it's kind of deep. So we're sitting there on the edge of the Grand Canyon, and we're just surveying this amazing, picturesque scene. And we were so overcome with what we saw. I just started singing, "Oh Lord my God, when I..." We sat there and we sang that song together because we were just so moved at what we were looking at. And she said, "This is so incredible. It's so beautiful." And I said, "Yeah, and this is what it looks like after he destroyed the earth. Think about what it must have looked like before." He is truly awesome. And I hope that we never lose sight of the wonder and the amazement and the majesty and all the things that we could say. I hope we never lose that. But let's not minimize it. Because to whom will you liken God? Second thing that I want us to see from this. Despite God's greatness and his power and all of these things that we've discussed, despite the fact that he is so far higher and greater than we are, God still cares about you and me. We are so small in comparison to him, and yet we are the most important thing in the universe to him. God does not care about rocks or trees or the waters or the fish or the bulls or the goats or anything else. He cares about people. People who bear his image. People whom he created to love them and to shower them with his goodness and his blessings. And God has, through Jesus Christ, turned heaven upside down to give us all of those abundant blessings that he wants us to enjoy because he cares about us. And I think about Psalm 8. When David said, "When I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, and when I see the stars, the work of your hands, what is man that you are mindful of him?" And the answer to that question is everything. We are everything to God. And don't ever lose sight of that fact either. And here's the final thing I want to suggest to you as we close our lesson. This is the God whom we serve. Therefore, trust him fully. He is worthy of our trust. He is worthy of our faith. Because look at what he has done. Look at what he is able to do. There is nothing that he cannot do. You know, we sing that with our kids, right? My God is so big, so strong, and so mighty. There's nothing my God can do. Oh yeah, it's just a cute little kid's song. No, it isn't. Look at all of these things that Isaiah says God is capable of doing. He can topple nations simply by breathing. He can pick up the mountains out of the ground and move them if he wants to do that. And we think he can't make time for my prayers? I think God is not big enough to handle my problems? And so Paul says in Romans the 8th chapter, and in verse 28, that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. He causes all things to work together for good. It doesn't say all things are good. He doesn't say God makes everything be good for his people. Because some of us have had some pretty miserable experiences in life. Some of us have experienced some pretty bad trials in life. Paul doesn't say our life is going to be great, never have any problems. But he says God can use those challenges. God can use those trials in ways that ultimately prove to be good. I have talked with people before whose lives were in shambles because of choices that they made. And they said, not even God can help me this time. There is no case that is beyond God's ability to fix. There is no prayer that we could pray to God that he says, I can't do anything about that. So what we need to do, brother and sister, is trust him with everything that we've got. Because he is worthy of our trust. He is strong enough to handle anything that we give to him. He is capable of providing for any need that we have. And our greatest needs are those spiritual needs that he has certainly made provision for through Jesus Christ. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, your greatest needs are spiritual needs. Your greatest needs are not a good job, not a good income. Your greatest needs are not things that are physical and temporal. Your greatest needs are those that have to do with your soul. And Jesus Christ has come to forgive you of your sins and to give you new hope and a new life. And if you're interested in that, we want to talk to you about that. If you need to come back to the Lord and renew your commitment to him again, please come now as we stand and sing together.